Hello, everyone. Welcome to another lecture, which is the first of our final unit in this class, which is on pop literature, otherwise known as popular literature. Most important question, as always, is what is it? What is pop or popular literature? Well, what makes this kind of literature different than some of the other things we've been reading in this class so far is that this is what is popular with normal, everyday people. This is usually fiction that people read for fun or entertainment, that sort of thing. It is not designed to be highbrow, serious, important literature in the way that some of the other texts we've read have been. This is the literature of everybody, of common people, not just the literature scholars. These are the things that are popular reads that most people, if they haven't read, have at least heard of at any given point in time. Now, of course, what is considered popular literature and what is considered more serious literature depends on the time, because Shakespeare's plays, for instance, when they were first written, were very much pop culture. The serious college-educated playwrights all looked down on this Shakespeare guy who didn't even have a college degree, and he was writing these plays that all the people loved, but those serious scholars, those serious theater goers knew was just rubbish compared to the great artistic plays that these other college-educated playwrights were making. And nobody remembers those plays that the intelligent college-educated playwrights were making, but everybody still remembers Shakespeare. And now Shakespeare, of course, is considered more high literature. But again, at the time, he was pop culture, like blockbuster movies, that sort of thing. So it changes over time. Some examples from today that you might recognize of what I'm talking about are things like The Hunger Games, for instance, and also the Percy Jackson books. Those kinds of books that everybody pretty much at a certain time frame, or if you were a certain age, read for fun, even if they didn't necessarily like reading in general, they read those things. And then, of course, they had the movie adaptations, which are very, very frequently happening with books that are pop fiction. Those two usually go hand in hand. You have the book that comes out, and then it becomes super, super popular, and then a movie gets made about it within a couple of years. Another example of that might be The Hate U Give, books like that. So this entire unit is going to be talking about these different forms of pop literature. Like next time, for instance, we're going to be talking about pulp fiction, and we'll be talking about comic books and science fiction. But today, in the first lesson, I want to take you back in time to pop literature of America, the same culture that we're all currently inhabiting right now, but back in the 1800s. Things were different at that time, and you will probably realize from the first text we read, where you're going to be reading this thing, and many of you are probably going to be like, this was like the Hunger Games to them? This is what they read for fun? And yes, this is what they read for fun back in America in the 1800s. Things were different back then, and the novels were different back then. Most people today, if you just want to experience a story for fun, or frankly, if you just want to do something for fun, most people do not grab a book and read. They go to a movie theater, they play video games, they get onto social media, those sorts of things. But in the 1800s, none of those things existed, right? So what did people do instead of those things? Well, they read novels. But these novels were very different from novels from today. And that's because they were serving a different purpose. Today, when you pick up a novel, you're looking for a story, something that just tells a coherent, engaging, usually interesting, action-packed story from beginning to end. You're going to get there with minimal interruption in the plot. People didn't read novels just for stories back in the 1800s. They wanted stories for sure, and all novels told stories, but they also had another function to them. I think novels in this time period were actually a lot like a TikTok feed today. It served a lot of the same purposes. Now, that might sound weird, so let me explain. One of the first things you notice about these novels are that they're super, super, super long. These are hundreds, if not thousands of pages long. Why are they so long, you might be asking? It's not because they had super epic stories that needed that long to be told, although that is the case in some novels, like Ben-Hur, for example. But the reason that they're so long most of the time is because they very frequently will completely stop the plot of the story and give you short essays or how-to guides or political arguments on various topics. This happens so frequently that it tends to really annoy modern readers because you're like, I don't need an essay on how to grow corn. I just want to read a novel. I want to know the story and what's happening to the characters. But you have to remember the time period. We tend to go to lots of different things for lots of different types of entertainment. If we want to have a story, we might watch an episode of a TV show or go to a movie theater and watch a movie or something like that. If we want to have an essay on how to do various stuff, we might go to a YouTube video or something like that. Or we might have a bunch of stuff put together in a feed that gives us randomly generated videos or short videos on different topics like TikTok. That'll give you a video of people dancing, and then a video of how to cook something, and then a video about how to fix your faucets, etc., etc. That's how novels function, as all of those things wrapped up into one, because back then they didn't have all of those different forms of media to be available to them. All they had was the novel. And so they wanted the novel to give them all that stuff. They wanted a story, but they also wanted to increase their knowledge about various topics through essays, through how to do things, guides, and they often also, just like on TikTok, wanted to see videos about various political topics. So they had these essays and these novels about politics and what was going on, either at the time of the novel or in their own day. This also, like with most people today, held the attention span of someone who might get bored with just the story, right? They might get bored just reading about this story on and on and on, but it keeps their attention when you break up the story with these other types of things, right? These essays, how-to guides, etc., etc. Two really good examples besides Ben-Hur of these types of novels are Moby Dick, which is probably the most famous of these, and if you read it, you will find a lot of the same stuff. You will be going along in the plot, and all of a sudden, the novel stops telling you the story, and it gives you a little how-to guide on how to gut a whale that you've caught, or a little biology lesson on whales, or a lesson on how a ship works and how the roles of each of the different people on the crew help make the ship function. Another example would be Uncle Tom's Cabin, which if you haven't read, you maybe want to consider. If there's any American novel from the 1800s that you might want to pick up for its cultural importance, Uncle Tom's Cabin is probably it. This is a story that was written during the time of slavery and about slavery. Fundamentally, it's about a great, great slave, and I mean, he was a great person named Uncle Tom, who is this beloved man by his whole community. Everybody loves Tom because he's just such a genuinely kind and empathetic human being. And because of the hard times that fall on the family that owns him, Tom gets sold off and eventually comes into the hands of a sadistic madman who ultimately tortures and kills Tom for no good reason. This was a novel that brought people to tears, a novel that infuriated a nation. And even though it's probably an exaggeration to say that it had a starting effect on the American Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, when he met the author, Harriet Beecher, Harriet Beecher? I think that's right. Harriet Beecher Stowe told her, oh, so here's the little woman who wrote that little book that started this big war. Had a very large impact on American culture. Okay, let's talk about the author of this particular novel, Lew Wallace, who was a very interesting person. He was a very, very, very decorated military veteran. He served in two different wars, the Mexican-American War and the American Civil War, where he was on the Union side. During the Civil War, he became one of the youngest men to be promoted to the rank of Major General. So he was a very important military leader inside of the Civil War. He was also a part of the court that tried the assassins of Abraham Lincoln. If you know American history, you might remember that John Wilkes Booth, the person who actually shot Lincoln, was never brought to trial. He died while they were trying to arrest him. But he was part of a larger conspiracy that was trying to kill not just Lincoln, but many members of the US government. And their other ones were caught, and he was a part of the court that tried them. He then later on served as the governor of New Mexico, and after that as the US ambassador to the country of Turkey. Along with all that, he also wrote many other historical novels besides Ben-Hur. So a good writer, but also a lot of other things besides a writer. There's one crazy story about him that while he was the governor of New Mexico, he was involved with Billy the Kid, who is a very famous outlaw from the Wild West. He was going to give Billy Kid a plea bargain where if he would testify against other outlaw individuals, he was going to get a lighter sentence. But even though Lew Wallace gave him a guarantee that that deal was going to happen, the other people inside the government who were handling the trial didn't agree, and they didn't hold up Wallace's deal. And so Billy the Kid broke out, and he was determined to shoot Lew Wallace and stormed into the Capitol building, ready to shoot him, but Wallace wasn't there at the time, so he wound up not getting killed by Billy the Kid. Interesting guy, really interesting guy. So that brings us to Ben-Hur, the very, very, very long novel. I just gave you a section from the very end of the novel. This text is extremely, extremely long. And it was the result of Wallace's extensive research into Jesus of Nazareth and the first century in Judea. So it tells the story of Jesus without having Jesus as the main character. It tells the story with this fictional character, Judah Ben-Hur, as the protagonist of the story who gets to meet Jesus. And so the readers kind of get to see the story of Jesus through the perspective of someone else, in this case, this fictional character. The narrator, of course, though, is the one who's telling the story, and the narrator is coming mostly from an American perspective. So this was a way of telling the story of the gospel in a way that a lot of Americans would resonate with, would understand. And he succeeded enormously well, because even though it's not a novel that many people read today, again, it was like the Hunger Games in its time. Like, everybody read Ben-Hur when it came out. It was immensely popular. It was a huge best-selling novel at the time. So it's the story of, like I said, this young Jewish political leader named Judah Ben, which means the son of Hur, and his feud against a man named Masala who was once upon a time his childhood friend. But as they grew up, their ethnic and political affiliations drive them apart and turn them into enemies. Because Judah, of course, is a Jew, whereas Masala is a Roman. And their conflict is, in many ways, a microcosm of the great conflict going on in the first century between Judea and Rome. And one thing the novel does very, very well is that it realistically portrays the tensions going on there. Rome, for those of you who haven't taken your World Civ classes yet, the Roman Empire, by this point, by the first century, had conquered most of the known world at that time. Rome was basically the world at this point. It was essentially, from what anybody in that time, for the most part, knew, it was the one world government. They didn't know about America, right? They had no idea that North America and South America existed. So nobody knew about that stuff. And there were some people who knew that Asia, specifically China, existed, but it was really difficult to get there, and most people just didn't know that it existed. And so for most people, for most practical purposes, Rome was the government of the world. It was extremely oppressive. People talk today about how oppressive the British Empire or the French or any of these other nations that during the Enlightenment and whatnot created all these colonies and conquered different places in the world and then oppressed the people living there. And as bad as those empires were, Rome was significantly worse. Rome would come in, they would conquer all of these different places, including Judea, right, where the Jewish people, they were scattered all over the place, but many of them were centered in Judea. And they would be this foreign empire that rolls in, they conquer them because they had greater military and technological power. And they would set up shop there, they would bring their technology with them. And one of the things they would do is make roads, for instance. Rome made the best roads probably of anybody ever. The Roman roads still exist for the most part everywhere they built roads, even now, these thousands and thousands of years later. American roads most likely will not last that long, but the Roman roads lasted a long time. They were much more technologically advanced than people realize. Romans had indoor plumbing, for instance, back thousands and thousands of years ago. And when Rome fell and a lot of that knowledge was lost for thousand some odd years, there weren't indoor toilets after that, even in America. When America started, it wasn't until like the 1900s that Americans got indoor toilets, but the Romans had them back 1 AD. So extremely technologically advanced, extremely oppressive, because infrastructure requires money. Then roads cost money. Then toilets cost money. And where did Rome get their money from? From the people that they conquered. They had to pay taxes to the empire, and these taxes were not low. They were high. And if you didn't pay those taxes, there were significant consequences for you. And I'm not talking about jail. I'm talking about they might destroy your ancestral home. They might destroy your fields. They might kill one of your kids. That kind of thing. The oppression was so bad that Jewish people, many of them, had a very logical reaction, which was they wanted to rebel. They were fed up with oppression, and some of them in the first century, at this time period of the novel, were starting to plot violent uprisings where they planned to overthrow the Romans and kick them out of their land, out of Judea, and reset up the kingdom of Israel. Judah in this story is one of those people. He was wronged by the Romans significantly, and he plans to create an uprising wherein they can throw off their Roman oppressors and they can start their own nation that's free once again. Many people, pretty much all of Israel at this time, was also believing that the Messiah, who was the heir to the kingdom of Israel, the rightful king, would arise, would show himself, and he would defeat the Romans when he came. He would throw off the Roman oppression, and he would restart the kingdom of Israel. This is what they were hoping for. This is what they were praying for. And that is the stage of this novel. Now, before I get into the section that we're talking about specifically, I also want to discuss that, like many, many popular novels, this very quickly became a source for film adaptations. Actually, the first film adaptation of this was a silent film back at the very beginning of cinema, but it's been adapted multiple times since then. I'm going to show you the trailers for the two most popular versions. First one was made in the 50s with Charlton Heston playing Ben-Hur, and I will show you that right now. I'll also give you a little bit more idea of the plot of the story.
You may conquer the land. You may slaughter the people. That is not the end. We will rise again. The day Rome falls, there will be a shout of freedom such as the world has never heard before. I believe in the past of my people and in their future. You are a conquered people. You and your mother and sister will die today. May God grant me vengeance. I don't believe in miracles. All life is a miracle. I should kiss you goodbye. Oh,
my people are praying for a man who can drive their team to victory over Messala. You could be that man.
My earliest memory of my dad is from the set of Ben-Hur. The one that really stands out in my mind is he used to give me rides in the chariot. How could that not stick in the memory of a young man?
If you stay here, you will find yourself part of this tragedy. I am already part of this tragedy. This is the day.
William Wyler's masterpiece, Ben-Hur, the ultimate collector's edition, for the first time ever on Blu-ray in high definition.
And now the 2016 version.
No matter where you're from, this strength is your body. That drum is your heartbeat. And your God is the glory of Rome. First, believe that.
How long were you a slave?
5 years.
What is your name?
Ben-Hur. My family was one of the most respected in Jerusalem. Welcome home.
Please, I need you to tell me who one's enemies are.
Messala, I won't name names until we were betrayed. By my own brother.
Messala! You know we've done nothing wrong. Rome's calling for blood. Crucified.
No!
The world you live in is Rome. Their laws, their power.
I won't let Messala go unpunished for what he's done to us. Our mother and sister. Was it a quick death?
Go, go, go!
Coward!
My family, they deserve justice for what's happened to them.
There is a way. In the arena, there is no law. Racing is a blood sport.
If you lose, you die. If your brother is the pride of Rome, defeat him and you'll defeat an empire. Then you will have your vengeance.
You have a voice. People would follow you. I would follow you.
Go, go, go!
Should have stayed away. You should have killed me.
I will.
Remember, first to finish,
Last to die.
Are we having fun now, brother? Stand and fight! Stand up now!
So there's that. Another thing I will show you is a scene from the Charlton Heston movie that is an adaptation of the scene from the novel where Judah first meets Jesus of Nazareth. This is where Judah is being marched as a slave to the galley ships, and something very interesting happens. Sorry, let me make sure I shared audio. Oh, didn't share at all. My mistake. Here we go. There we go.
Water for the soldiers! Soldiers first!
Water!
Get away from that well! No water for them! Get them away from that well! Come on, you! Come on, you! Water for the horses!
Water! Water!
Soldiers first! Here! Wait! No water for him.
God, help me.
You! I said no water for him! All right, on your feet, all of you. Get them on their feet. Back in line, you dog! On your feet. Get them going. You there! Back to your place! Back to your place! Forward, you dog!
So, as this scene gives you an idea, Judah and Jesus of Nazareth have a very complex relationship in this novel. On the one hand, Judah really respects Jesus, and they have that personal connection of that time Jesus helped him when he was dying of thirst. At the same time, there are things that Jesus teaches that Judah is not on board with. Jesus teaches that you should turn the other cheek when someone strikes you. Jesus says that you should pray for your enemies. Those who persecute you, you should love them, not hate them and fight against them. And Judah just can't accept that because of all the wrongs that have happened to him and all the evil that Rome has done, not just to him, but his family and all the Jewish people. He just can't accept that. So Judah has been building a force to overthrow the Roman government. He's been building a military force to overthrow that. And the section that we're reading is the climax of the novel, which happens during Passover, which is the night that Jewish people celebrate their freedom from an oppressive foreign nation, Egypt, that they were delivered, that God, Adonai, God of Israel, delivered them from. And here they are celebrating this day they were delivered from an oppressive country when they are being oppressed by a foreign country. And so tensions are really, really high. Not only that, there's been another group of people who did an uprising because they have one of them in custody. They put it down and they have one of them in custody. His name is Barabbas. And Judah witnesses stories that should be very familiar to you if you know the Gospels in the New Testament. He witnesses the arrest of Jesus. And he tries to rescue him alone in the garden, but he's not successful. And when he hears that the Romans are going to execute Jesus, he mobilizes his troops to save Jesus, but that also fails. And there's a sense in which everything is working against Judah's efforts to save Jesus, but not just externally, but because of Jesus himself. Jesus doesn't want to be saved. And at first, this makes absolutely no sense to Judah. Not only why would you not want to be saved from death, but crucifixion. If you guys don't know anything about crucifixion, let me tell you, it is absolutely the worst way to die. The most excruciating, most painful possible way to die. Historically, when you nail someone, and I mean the Romans, when they nailed somebody to a cross, what would happen is that if you just nailed their hands to a cross, and then all their body weight was going on their wrists. You couldn't actually breathe if that was the case. So someone would die pretty quickly through suffocation that way. Romans wanted to make this a torturous, worst way to die imaginable. So they came up with one of the most diabolical ways of torturing a human that has ever been invented by human beings, where not only would they nail your hands, but they would also nail your feet to the cross so that you could actually push up on the nail in your legs, get some traction and breathe. So you would shift your body weight onto the nail in your legs, again, that nail driving in the flesh, so that you could breathe until that becomes too painful, and then you go down and your weight is now the nail pressing on your bones and muscles in your arm, until once again you have to breathe and you push back up, and you go up and down for days sometimes, until you finally can't take it anymore and you stop going up and you suffocate. Jesus had it significantly worse than that because he was scourged before he was crucified. Scourging is when they take a whip, not just made of leather or something like that, but that has hooks in it, usually made of metal or bone or stone, and they would take that and they would whip literally all over your body. This means they are tearing the flesh off of your bones. Most of the time, or at least some of the time, organs will become exposed, internal organs, through this as they're ripping the flesh off of you. So they do that to Jesus first, and then they crucify him. And as the novel tells us, while they are nailing him to a cross, he says, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." For, I think, they don't know what they're doing. Nobody in the history of the world, guys, ever prayed for the people who were crucifying them. No one ever got scourged and then prayed for the forgiveness of the people who did that to them. This is unheard of. So why would anybody willingly go through that? And on top of that, pray that God forgives the people who did that to him? Well, there are lots of reasons. But one of the things I got out of Ben-Hur's telling of the story is that violence is a cycle. And you saw that all throughout the novel. Violence, the Romans do violence to Judah, which then means he retaliates, and there's more violence to the Romans, but does it end there? Of course not. Then the Romans want to retaliate with more violence. This is not just historical, guys. This is the way of the world. Violence is a cycle. And it keeps going and going and going and going, right? Because once one person does violence to another person, that person's got to get violence back. They have to keep paying until someone breaks the cycle.